What would you do if a trained police dog suddenly broke every rule just to crash into a courtroom and lead you to a crying child no one knew was missing? It started on an ordinary Wednesday morning, the kind where you expect routine and nothing more. Officer Ethan Cole had been patrolling the downtown area with Shadow, his trusted canine partner of 3 years. Shadow, a massive German shepherd trained in narcotics, search and rescue, and crowd control, was the definition of discipline. He never pulled on the leash without command. He never barked without reason. He never disobeyed, until today. As they passed by the county courthouse, something changed in the air. Shadow stopped abruptly on the sidewalk, his ears perked, nostrils flaring. He let out a low, urgent whine and began to paw at the ground. Ethan tugged gently on the leash, signaling him to keep moving. But instead of following, the dog resisted, muscles tightening, head turning sharply toward the courthouse doors. "Shadow, heel," Ethan commanded, his voice firm but calm, but Shadow didn't heel. He growled softly, not in aggression, but in warning, then lunged forward, dragging Ethan a full step toward the entrance. The officer's boots scraped against the pavement as he regained balance, eyes narrowing. He had trained with this dog through blizzards, bomb threats, and building collapses. Shadow had never behaved like this, not once. "What's gotten into you, boy?" Shadow whined again, louder this time. His eyes locked onto the glass doors of the courthouse as if something or someone was calling to him from inside. Ethan's instincts told him something was off. He radioed in to dispatch, casually noting that he'd be stepping inside the courthouse with his K9. No urgency. No alarm, just a gut feeling. As they entered the marble foyer, Shadow's behavior escalated. He began sniffing feverishly, moving left and right, weaving between confused civilians and security guards. Ethan tried to keep up, apologizing to startled onlookers as his partner surged ahead, tail stiff, body trembling with urgency. "Is everything okay, officer?" asked a security guard at the front checkpoint. "Honestly, I don't know yet," Ethan replied, gripping the leash with both hands. "He's never done this before." Inside, the courthouse buzzed with its usual mix of tension and bureaucracy. Lawyers shuffled by with files tucked under their arms. Clerks clicked away at their keyboards. A bailiff raised an eyebrow as the duo stormed past. But Shadow didn't care. Something was pulling him, something only he could feel. They reached the second-floor landing, where courtrooms lined the hallway like quiet caves of judgment. Shadow stopped for a moment, nose in the air, then turned sharply to the left toward courtroom 2B, where a child custody case was being heard. Ethan could hear the muffled voices from within, the firm tone of a judge, the strained explanations of attorneys, the occasional rustle of papers. And then, without warning, Shadow lunged. The leash slipped from Ethan's hand. The heavy oak doors of courtroom 2B swung open with a loud bang as the dog charged inside. "Shadow, no!" Ethan rushed after him, breath caught in his throat. The room fell silent. A lawyer froze mid-sentence. A woman gasped. A court reporter's fingers hovered above her keyboard. Judge Helen Blake, known for her no-nonsense demeanor, stared down from the bench, stunned. Shadow didn't bark, he didn't growl. He didn't even glance at the startled faces around him. He ran straight down the center aisle, past the wooden pews, past the shocked attorneys, and toward the judge's bench with laser focus. And there, right in front of everyone, he sat. Just sat. His tail still, chest rising and falling quickly, eyes fixed underneath the bench. Ethan caught up seconds later, face flushed, hat in hand. "I'm so sorry, Your Honor." "He's never done anything like this. I'll get him out immediately." But before Ethan could reach him, Shadow let out a low, mournful whimper, then gently laid down, his massive body stretched along the floor, nose nudging the dark space beneath the judge's platform. Everyone watched. No one moved. Then a tiny sound broke the silence. A soft, high-pitched sob. Ethan froze. So did Judge Blake. Very slowly, The officer knelt beside Shadow and peered under the bench. And that's when he saw her. A small girl, maybe 4 years old. Curled up in a tight ball, cheeks streaked with tears, her dress crumpled and dusty. She stared back with wide, frightened eyes, too scared to speak, too tired to run. Her name, they would later learn, was Sophie Monroe. The courtroom, once frozen in tension, erupted in controlled chaos. The judge recessed the session immediately. A social worker called for medical personnel. An officer contacted building security. Ethan didn't move. Neither did Shadow. He simply whispered, "Good boy," and watched as the massive German shepherd rested his head gently on the floor, close enough for the frightened child to feel the warmth of his breath. This was no ordinary morning. This wasn't about court cases or protocols. This was about instinct, loyalty, and the unexplainable bond between a dog and the people he chooses to protect. And it was just the beginning. The doors of courtroom 2B swung open with a thunderous bang, reverberating through the high-ceiling chamber like a gunshot. The reaction was instant. A lawyer, mid-sentence, dropped his papers. A woman in the gallery let out a soft gasp. The court stenographer's fingers froze above her keys. And at the front of the room, Judge Helen Blake, a woman known for her steely professionalism, halted her gavel mid-swing, startled by the disruption. All eyes turned to the source of the commotion. It wasn't a suspect or an angry defendant. It was a dog. A massive German shepherd, muscles taut with purpose, stormed into the courtroom like he owned the place. His handler, Officer Ethan Cole, stumbled in behind him, clearly outpaced and out of breath. "I'm so sorry, Your Honor," Ethan called out, pulling back on the leash. Hey, broke protocol. I couldn't stop him." But Shadow paid no attention to the apology. His focus was absolute. He darted down the center aisle with precision, weaving past pews of stunned spectators and legal professionals. Not once did he bark or growl. There was no aggression in his movements, only intensity. Purpose. Something deep inside him knew. There was someone in this room who needed him. Ethan chased after him, his boots pounding the marble floor. By the time he reached the front of the room, Shadow was already at the judge's bench, sniffing with furious determination. And then, just as suddenly as he had burst in, he stopped. He lowered himself to the floor, ears pricked forward, tail flat, and began whining soft, pleading whines, not of fear or discomfort, but of urgency. His snout pressed against the wooden trim under the judge's seat. Judge Blake leaned forward, alarm rising behind her composed expression. "What's he doing?" she asked, her voice tight. Ethan didn't answer. He knelt beside his partner, looked beneath the judge's platform, and froze. There, barely visible in the dim shadows, was a child. A little girl, no older than 4, curled into a ball, cheeks stained with tears, hands trembling. Her tiny frame was wrapped in a soft blanket, her shoes missing. She didn't speak, she only stared. Shadow nudged the floor gently, staying perfectly still as the girl's eyes met his. Her breathing slowed, just a little, as if sensing that she was no longer alone. Ethan turned to the judge. "There's a child under here." "A little girl, she's terrified. Looks like she's been hiding." Within moments, the courtroom shifted from formal procedure to emergency response. Judge Blake immediately recessed the session. Court officers rushed in, gently guiding stunned attendees out into the hallway. A medical team was called, and while chaos swirled around them, Shadow did not move. He lay at the edge of the platform, watching over the child like a sentinel. Ethan reached in slowly. "It's okay, sweetheart," he whispered. "You're safe now." The girl didn't flinch. She blinked once, and then, tentatively, her small hand emerged from the blanket. Not toward Ethan, toward Shadow. She touched his fur, and for the first time in what must have been hours, she whispered, "Doggy." Her name, they would soon learn, was Sophie Monroe. She had been at the courthouse that morning with her grandmother, Miss Thelma, for an unrelated legal matter. In the shuffle of crowds and busy corridors, Sophie had gotten lost and, in her panic, had slipped into the courtroom unnoticed, crawling under the bench to hide. No one had realized she was missing. Not until now. While the emergency responders checked Sophie over, another figure in the courtroom remained seated, watching everything unfold with wide, solemn eyes. Emily Carter, just 8 years old, sat beside her caseworker in the gallery. The custody hearing that had been interrupted was hers. Emily had been in and out of foster care for the past 2 years, ever since her mother died and her father was incarcerated. She had become used to courtrooms, judges, and the endless shuffle of paperwork that seemed to define her life. But today was different. Today, she watched a dog risk punishment to find a child no one even knew was missing. She watched adults spring into action, not for procedure, but for love. And she watched Sophie the frightened, barefoot girl reach out for comfort, not from the officers or the judge, but from a dog who had somehow known exactly where she was. Emily's eyes welled up, but she didn't look away. Because for the first time in a long time, this courtroom didn't feel cold. It didn't feel like a place where decisions were made about her life without her voice. It felt human. Ethan sat on the floor beside Shadow as the paramedics gently lifted Sophie into a warm blanket. The little girl clung to Shadow's fur, refusing to let go. "You found her," Ethan murmured, brushing his hand over the dog's head. "How did you know?" Shadow didn't answer, of course. He simply looked up at Ethan, eyes calm and steady, and somehow that was answer enough. Back in the gallery, Judge Blake remained in her seat, watching everything with a tight grip on her gavel. The last 30 minutes had cracked something in her armor. She had spent decades adjudicating families, trying to find the right answers through custody reports and legal briefs. But what she had just witnessed, that was truth. That was loyalty, and that was love, unfiltered and unspoken. She glanced down at her docket. Emily Carter's name sat at the top of the stack. Judge Blake closed the file and stood slowly. "We'll reconvene in 1 hour," she said. "But when we do," she paused, eyes settling on Emily, "we will finish this hearing with clearer hearts." And with that, she stepped off the bench. The room began to clear. But one thing was certain. No one would ever forget the day a dog defied the rules and reminded an entire courtroom what truly matters. Everything had frozen. The courtroom, once filled with the dull murmur of legal proceedings and shuffling paperwork, now held its collective breath. A massive German Shepherd Shadow lay on the polished floor, tail still, nose pointed directly beneath the ornate wooden bench where Judge Helen Blake sat moments earlier. The bailiff, unsure whether to intervene or simply watch, kept one hand on his radio and the other clenched by his side. Shadow whimpered. It was a sound that cut through the thick silence. Not one of fear, not pain, but something deeper, urgent, protective. Officer Ethan Cole, Shadow's handler, knelt beside him. His knees touched the marble, his heart pounding. This wasn't a drill. This wasn't training. Whatever had drawn Shadow into this courtroom, he was now laser-focused on it. "Easy, boy," Ethan whispered. "What is it?" Shadow didn't look at him. His ears twitched. His massive frame stayed low. He was zeroed in on someone beneath the bench. Ethan slowly ducked his head under the overhang, blinking to adjust to the shadows. And there, in the narrow crawl space between the floor and the wall, he saw her, a little girl. Curled in on herself, knees tucked tight to her chest, her dress wrinkled and her cheeks streaked with tears. Her dark hair was tangled, and she was barefoot. Her eyes wide and unblinking locked on Ethan's for just a second before she recoiled slightly, hiding her face in the folds of her blanket. Ethan's breath caught. "She's here," he said, loud enough for the room to hear.
There's a child under the bench." The reaction was immediate.
Judge Blake stood abruptly. The bailiff called for medical assistance. Lawyers and caseworkers moved instinctively out of the way as court officers cleared a path. But Ethan stayed still. He didn't want to startle her. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said gently, lying down on his stomach to get closer.
"My name's Ethan. You're safe now, that big dog over there." "His name's Shadow. He's here to help." There was no response. But the little girl's eyes peeked out again this time, slowly. And then something remarkable happened. She reached out a tiny hand, trembling, and rested it on Shadow's fur. Shadow didn't move. He simply closed his eyes and let out a slow exhale as if to say, "You're okay now. I've got you." They would later learn her name was Sophie Monroe. She had come to the courthouse earlier that morning with her grandmother, Miss Thelma, to attend a civil proceeding in a different wing. Somewhere between the metal detectors and the escalators, Sophie had gotten separated. In the rush of court traffic and echoing halls, no one noticed at first. She had wandered, frightened and confused, into the nearest courtroom with an open door, and when the crowd inside became overwhelming, she did what any terrified 4-year-old might do. She crawled under the judge's bench to hide, and waited. For over 3 hours, while bailiffs searched and her grandmother tearfully pleaded with security, Sophie had been just feet away from dozens of adults, unseen, unheard, and all alone, until Shadow arrived. Paramedics entered quietly, crouching near Ethan. He held up a hand. "She's responsive," he said softly, "but she's not ready to move yet."
"Let's give her a second." It wasn't protocol, but it was compassion, and it was exactly what Sophie needed. Shadow remained her anchor.
As one EMT reached in with a flashlight, Sophie's fingers tightened in the dog's fur. "Let's not rush it," Ethan repeated. Minutes passed. Then slowly, Sophie inched forward, first her knees, then her shoulders. And finally, her entire tiny body emerged, still wrapped in the too-thin blanket. The entire room watched in stunned silence. Shadow stood, moved back just enough to let her out, and then nuzzled her gently, his nose brushing against her cheek. Sophie didn't cry. She simply leaned against him. From across the room, Emily Carter watched. She hadn't moved from her seat since Shadow burst in. The case being heard, the one interrupted by Shadow's sudden entrance, was hers. She was the reason this courtroom had been filled with legal counsel and hopeful adoptive parents. And yet Emily wasn't thinking about her case. She was watching Sophie, watching how the little girl clung to the dog like he was the only solid thing in the world, watching how Officer Cole kept his voice low and calm, like someone who understood what fear looked like. Emily knew that fear. She had lived it. And in that moment, she didn't see a stranger under the judge's bench. She saw herself a younger version, just as lost, just as unseen. Judge Helen Blake stepped forward, her heels clicking slowly against the tile. She crouched near Ethan, her professional composure flickering. "Is she okay?" "She's safe," Ethan said. "Just scared." The judge looked at Sophie, then at Shadow. "Your dog just changed everything," she murmured. As paramedics finally guided Sophie into the hallway to reunite with her sobbing grandmother, the courtroom remained quiet. No one knew quite what to say. Until a child's voice broke the silence. "Shadow's a hero," Emily whispered. No one disagreed. Because he was. And while most people would remember this day for the discovery of a missing child, those who were there who felt what happened knew the truth. This wasn't just about finding Sophie, it was about what found her. A dog, a moment, a feeling, and the beginning of something much bigger than a courtroom could contain. While paramedics gently led Sophie Monroe out of the courtroom, still clinging to Shadow's fur, someone else remained rooted to her seat, watching with wide, solemn eyes. Her name was Emily Carter. She was 8 years old, dressed in a simple navy blue dress,
her hair pulled back with a barrette that was starting to loosen. Emily sat beside her caseworker at the far end of the gallery. She hadn't spoken since the hearing began. She didn't fidget. She didn't cry. She just watched. And what she saw in those few minutes would change her forever. Emily had been through the system long enough to know how courtrooms worked. She had sat in 4 others like this in the past 2 years, each time listening to strangers talk about her as if she wasn't in the room. Her mother had died in a car accident. Her father, whom she barely remembered, had gone to prison shortly after. The rest of her life had become a shuffled deck of case files, placement reports, and people who smiled kindly while reminding her they couldn't keep her. So today, when she arrived at courtroom 2B, she expected more of the same. Another family considering her. Another judge trying to appear warm, but tired. Another day where adults talked about her like a math problem to be solved. But then Shadow broke through the doors, and for once, the room was not about legalities. It was about someone who needed help and someone who cared enough to act. Emily watched every second unfold with a stillness beyond her years. She saw the dog burst in, uninvited but determined. She saw Officer Ethan Cole stumble in behind him, apologizing profusely, yet refusing to pull the dog away. She saw people gasp, frown, whisper until they all fell quiet as the truth was revealed. There was a child hiding under the judge's bench. A girl younger than Emily, smaller, shaking. And it was Shadow who found her. Not the bailiffs, not the clerks, not the security cameras, the dog. And he didn't bark. He didn't cause harm. He simply lay down and stayed with her, as if to say, "I see you, I won't leave you." Emily's throat tightened. She didn't know Sophie, had never seen her before. But she knew what it felt like to be that small, that scared, that forgotten. She remembered hiding under her grandmother's dining table the night her mom didn't come home. She remembered curling up in a stranger's guest room on her first night in foster care, afraid to unpack. She remembered whispering to herself at bedtime, pretending someone was still there to answer back. So when she looked at Sophie, she didn't just see a frightened child, she saw a mirror. The courtroom buzzed as officers and social workers bustled around, but Emily sat frozen in her seat. Her caseworker leaned over, whispering something, but Emily didn't respond. Her eyes were locked on Shadow and Sophie and the space between them. A space where something invisible had bloomed. Not noise, not confusion, but connection. That was the moment everything began to shift for her. At some point, Judge Helen Blake looked toward Emily from the bench. She noticed the way the child's hands were folded tightly in her lap, the way her eyes weren't darting or distracted, but steady, present, witnessing. And something about that quiet gaze pulled at the judge's chest. This was not the expression of a child detached from the world. This was the expression of someone who had seen too much, too young, and was still choosing to care. Minutes passed. Sophie had been safely reunited with her grandmother. Officer Cole had taken Shadow outside to give the girl space. The courtroom began to clear, whispers trailing like smoke. And still, Emily sat in silence. She finally turned to her caseworker and asked softly, "What's going to happen to the little girl?" The caseworker looked surprised. "Sophie? She's okay now?" "She was just lost for a while." Emily nodded. Then, after a pause, she said, "I know what that feels like." The woman beside her blinked, caught off guard by the weight of that sentence from someone so small. In the hallway, a few people were still gathered, bailiffs talking in hushed tones, courthouse staff shaking their heads in disbelief. Word of the incident had already begun to spread. But back inside the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed completely. It no longer felt like a sterile chamber of decisions. It felt like a place where something real had happened, something good, and that's what Emily felt too. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like an outsider in the middle of her own story. She felt seen. not because anyone had pointed to her or called her name, but because Shadow had shown everyone that sometimes it takes more than rules to find what's really missing. It takes instinct, loyalty, and above all, heart. As the judge returned from recess, Emily sat up straighter. She didn't know yet what would happen next, if this family would choose her, if this hearing would end with papers or more waiting. But something inside her had shifted. She had seen love walk into a courtroom unannounced, and she had seen it change everything. For a long time, no one in the courtroom said a word. They just watched two little girls sitting quietly on the floor, their hands clasped gently, their bodies leaning slightly into each other, with Shadow, the loyal German shepherd, lying protectively beside them. No drama. No instructions. Just stillness. And something began to shift. At the front of the courtroom, Judge Helen Blake sat back down in her chair, not because the hearing had resumed, but because her legs suddenly felt unsteady. In over 15 years as a family court judge, she had seen almost everything: angry divorces, heartbreaking testimonies, endless custody battles. She had read thousands of psychological evaluations, observed hundreds of children under pressure. She had seen tears, she had seen rage, she had seen silence that screamed louder than any words. But she had never, not once, seen what she was seeing now. An 8-year-old girl named Emily Carter, who had spent 2 years bouncing between foster homes, had just comforted a child she didn't know, not with rehearsed words, not with well-meaning adult phrases, but with presence, with warmth, with truth. And she had done it all without being asked. Across the aisle sat Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, the couple who had come to court today as Emily's prospective adoptive parents. They had read her file, of course. They knew her story, the death of her mother, the father in prison, the placements that hadn't lasted. They had agreed to meet her through today's supervised hearing, with the cautious detachment many adoptive parents are taught to use at first. "We're still deciding," they'd told the caseworker. "We like her on paper, but it's a lot to take on." Now they sat frozen, watching the girl they weren't sure they were ready for become a pillar of strength for someone else. Mrs. Whitmore's hand crept slowly over her husband's. He didn't say a word. He just nodded, his eyes never leaving Emily. In the back corner, a clerk quietly stepped away from her computer and whispered to another staff member, "Did you see what she did?" "I saw everything," the other replied. "And I think I'm going to cry." Officer Ethan Cole, still standing quietly near the wall, held Shadow's leash loosely in one hand but made no move to retrieve him. He knew his partner wouldn't budge until the moment was truly over. Instead, Ethan watched as Emily gently tucked a strand of Sophie's hair behind her ear, murmuring something soft in Spanish. Sophie nodded, her head still resting lightly on Emily's shoulder. No trauma training. Oh. No textbook technique, just instinct, just love. Judge Blake finally cleared her throat. She glanced at the Whitmores. "I think you should see this for what it is," she said softly. Mr. Whitmore looked at her, blinking back tears. "We are, Mrs. Whitmore added, "We came here hoping to find out who Emily was. I think we just did." The judge turned toward the caseworker seated nearby, who was now dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "She doesn't need a placement," the judge said. "She needs a family." Moments later, the room was gently cleared. Court officers helped escort unrelated parties out into the hallway. The hearing would resume shortly, but everyone seemed to understand that something more important had just taken place, something that wasn't in the docket or on the agenda. Shadow, sensing the energy in the room shift, finally stood. Sophie whimpered slightly at the loss of his warmth, but Emily squeezed her hand. "I'm still here," she whispered. "You're not alone." Sophie nodded. Outside the courtroom, the story was already spreading like wildfire. Courthouse staff were calling one another.
Emails were bouncing between departments. Did you hear what happened in 2B? The K9 found a lost kid. Now wait till you hear what the other girl did. But inside, the people who mattered most weren't thinking about the headlines. They were thinking about what they'd witnessed. Not a rescue exactly, but a revelation that the child they had come to evaluate had become the very reason everyone in the room had found a new perspective. Later, as the room was reset and the judge prepared to resume the official hearing, the energy had changed, not just for the professionals, for Emily too. She had felt eyes on her all afternoon. Usually, that made her shrink inside, but now she felt lighter, not because someone praised her or promised her a home, but because finally she had done something that mattered, and she had done it her way. Before taking the bench again, Judge Blake paused beside Emily. "You did something today that a lot of grown-ups forget how to do," she said. Emily looked up, surprised. "You didn't wait for permission to be kind," the judge continued. "That takes courage." Emily didn't know how to respond, so she just said the simplest thing. She looked scared. "I used to feel like that." The judge nodded. "And you remembered. That's the part that changes everything." The courtroom would go on. Documents would be signed, cases would be filed, names would change. But for those who had been there, who had watched one child reach out to another while the world watched in awe, nothing would ever be quite the same. And neither would Emily Carter's future. The hallway outside courtroom 2B had become a scene of quiet celebration. The crisis was over. The little girl had been found, but what lingered most wasn't the chaos, it was the calm that followed. And at the center of that calm stood a German shepherd named Shadow. He didn't bark. He didn't seek attention. He didn't pose for pictures. He simply stood beside Sophie Monroe, the 4-year-old girl he had found hiding under the judge's bench, and refused to leave her side. Even as paramedics finished their checkups, even after courthouse officers gave the all-clear, Shadow remained where he was, head lowered to her height, eyes steady and warm. Every time Sophie shifted or whimpered, his ears would twitch, and his tail would give a soft thump against the marble floor, as if to say, "Still here, little one, you're safe." Shadow wasn't trained for missing children. He was a K9 unit, dog-trained in narcotics detection, search protocols, and handler protection. He had served with Officer Ethan Cole for over 3 years. Together, they had helped solve drug cases, secure high-risk events, and support other officers during tense operations. He was, by all accounts, a working dog. But today, Shadow had broken every rule he was trained to follow, and it had made all the difference. Miss Thelma, Sophie's grandmother, was escorted in by security just moments after her granddaughter was found. She was trembling, part from relief, part from disbelief. When she spotted Sophie sitting safely on the floor, nestled beside the dog who had refused to leave her, she gasped and covered her mouth with shaking hands. "Oh, my baby, thank God, she whispered. Sophie, still quiet and clutching Shadow's fur, looked up at her grandmother with eyes that were tired, but no longer frightened. "She was with him," Officer Cole said gently, gesturing to the dog. "He found her. He knew something was wrong. Pulled me straight here. Wouldn't stop until he got to her." Miss Thelma knelt beside Sophie, wrapping her arms tightly around her, whispering thanks in every direction, toward the officers, toward the judge, but especially toward Shadow. She even reached into her oversized purse and pulled out a pack of liver treats, fumbling to open it with grateful, clumsy fingers. "Can I give him one?" she asked through tears. "Please?" Ethan smiled. "You'll be his best friend for life." Shadow, ever gentle, took the treat from her hand with careful teeth and settled again beside Sophie. The story traveled fast. By the time the court resumed its regular schedule, courthouse staff had already texted photos to family members. The front desk clerk called her sister to share what she'd seen. A janitor snapped a photo from a respectful distance, whispering, "He's a real hero, isn't he? He was, but he didn't know it.
Shadow wasn't in it for praise. He wasn't in it for photos, medals, or recognition. He was in it because something inside him had known that someone small, someone scared, was in need, and that no one else had seen it yet. That was enough. Later that day, when the judge called a recess, she did something she'd never done in her career. She requested that Shadow and Officer Cole return to the courtroom not as security, but as guests of honor. Ethan led his partner down the aisle, leash loose in his hand. The moment Shadow stepped through the doors again, Sophie's face lit up like sunlight after rain. She reached for him instantly. The judge smiled. "Let the record reflect," Judge Helen Blake said, "that this courtroom acknowledges an unofficial officer in service today." Laughter and light applause rippled through the room. Shadow didn't react to the praise. He simply laid down beside Sophie once more and rested his chin on her lap. Later, as things began to wind down, Sophie was gently encouraged to leave for home. But she wouldn't budge, not without Shadow. Tears welled in her eyes as she clutched his fur tightly.
"I'll be okay," she said finally, in a voice so soft it could have disappeared. "But can he walk me to the car?" The request, simple as it was, brought a hush over everyone present. Ethan looked to the judge, who simply nodded. "Of course he can." So Shadow escorted Sophie and Miss Thelma through the courthouse doors, down the steps, and all the way to their waiting car. He walked beside her like a bodyguard, a friend, a protector. Only when the car door closed and Sophie waved from the window did Shadow finally look up at Ethan and return to his side. In the days that followed, the story spread across the county and beyond. A few local news outlets picked it up. K9 hero discovers missing girl inside courtroom. Rescue in courtroom 2B. German Shepherd's instinct saves the day. But for those who had been there, who had felt the moment as it unfolded, the real story wasn't just that Shadow found a girl. It was that he stayed, that he didn't leave her, even when the danger had passed, that he sat beside her when no one else knew what to say, that he reminded everyone in that room of something deeper than duty, loyalty, presence, compassion without words. Later that week, Shadow received an official commendation from the department. They gave him a new collar, a small plaque, a printed certificate with his paw print at the bottom. But to Shadow, his reward had already come. It came in the form of a little girl's steady heartbeat, calming under his watch. It came in the whisper of thank you as she buried her face in his neck. It came in the knowledge, silent, but certain, that he had done something no one else could. He had seen her, and that made him, in the eyes of many, not just a K9, but a legend. Courtroom 2B wasn't the same place it had been that morning. The marble pillars, the towering bench, the neatly stacked files all remained. But something had changed in the air. Where once there had been tension, now there was tenderness. Where once there had been cautious observation, now there was clarity. And the person who had unknowingly become the center of that shift was an 8-year-old girl named Emily Carter. The hearing resumed quietly after lunch, though the energy in the room was entirely different. Judge Helen Blake returned to the bench, her robe straight, her gavel untouched. She looked down at the docket before her, at the case she'd read multiple times over the past month. In the matter of Emily Carter, a minor, status, eligible for adoption, currently in foster care, candidate family, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore. She had prepared a dozen questions for the hearing. But after what had just unfolded in her courtroom, she found that only one question truly mattered. What kind of person is this child? And today, she'd been given the answer not through documents, but through actions. Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore sat side by side at their table. But now, their posture had shifted. Earlier that day, their expressions had been guarded, compassionate, but hesitant. They had spoken in measured tones about exploring adoption and assessing compatibility. But now they were leaning forward, their hands clasped together, their eyes soft and sure. They had seen something they hadn't expected. Not just a child who needed a home, but a child who had already become someone's shelter. Emily entered the courtroom holding the hand of her caseworker. Her dress was slightly wrinkled from the morning. A single loose braid had come undone at the side, but she walked with calm, even steps. Her eyes scanned the room, looking perhaps instinctively for Shadow. He wasn't inside, but she smiled anyway, like she could still feel him watching from somewhere nearby. She took her seat. Judge Blake cleared her throat and looked directly at the Whitmores. "You've had the opportunity to observe Emily today," she said. "Given everything that's happened, do you still feel you need more time to decide?" There was a pause. Then Mr. Whitmore spoke, voice steady. "No, Your Honor. We don't need more time." Mrs. Whitmore continued, her voice thick with emotion. "Today we saw who Emily really is, not just a file or a report, but her heart, her kindness, the way she reached out to a stranger without hesitation." She turned to Emily and smiled through tears. She didn't wait to be asked. She didn't check for permission. She just saw someone in pain and moved toward them. She paused. "That's the kind of daughter we'd be proud to raise." Emily's caseworker blinked rapidly, trying not to cry. Even the court reporter looked up from her keyboard, her fingers frozen. Judge Blake sat back, visibly moved. She had seen many hearings end in adoption, but rarely did they feel like a door opening in real time. A child being welcomed, not out of obligation or logistics, but out of recognition. Out of love. "I think the record speaks for itself," the judge said. She glanced down, then added, "But just in case it doesn't, let me be clear." She turned toward Emily. "You showed this courtroom more grace and compassion today than most adults manage in a lifetime. I believe that makes you ready for a family, and I believe this family is ready for you." Emily's eyes widened. She looked from the judge to the Whitmores to her caseworker, then back again. Does that mean?" Mrs. Whitmore nodded, tears rolling freely now. "If you want to," she said softly, "we'd like to be your parents." Emily didn't speak at first. Instead, she stood from her chair, walked across the room, and into the arms of the woman who would soon be her mother. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. It was the moment a life turned a corner. The court officer handed the judge the official forms. With a quiet tap of her gavel, Judge Blake finalized the hearing. Emily Carter, after 2 years in the system, was now Emily Whitmore. The room clapped softly. No one was instructed to. They just did. And then the doors opened again, just in time for Shadow and Officer Ethan Cole to walk in. Emily turned at the sound of the claws tapping against the floor. Her face lit up like sunrise. The judge smiled. "Would our courtroom hero like to be part of this moment?" Ethan gave Shadow a nod. "Go on." The dog trotted over to Emily and gently nudged her side. She knelt, threw her arms around his thick neck, and whispered into his ear something no one else could hear. But if you asked Shadow, he'd tell you it was perfect. The courtroom had done its job that day. But more importantly, it had witnessed something sacred. Not just a legal decision, but a human one. Not just a girl finding a family, but a family choosing her, not for who they hoped she might become, but for exactly who she already was. 3 weeks later, the courtroom was filled again. But this time there was no tension, no uncertainty. No case to be debated, only celebration. At the front of courtroom 2B, a small table had been placed in front of the judge's bench, draped with a soft white cloth and a bouquet of wildflowers. A single pen rested on a leather-bound document, the adoption decree. Today was Emily Carter's adoption day. And everyone who mattered was there. She wore a pale yellow dress, the kind with little flowers embroidered at the hem. Her hair had been brushed and braided by Mrs.
Whitmore, who now stood to the side with a proud, nervous smile. Mr. Whitmore, hands folded carefully in front of him, looked like he was trying not to cry before the first photo was even taken. The courtroom was quieter than usual, not out of solemnity, but respect. This was not the end of a legal process. This was the beginning of a family. As the doors opened and the final guests entered, heads turned and then smiles bloomed. Shadow walked down the aisle like he had done it 1,000 times. No leash today. No uniform. Just a fresh, navy blue bandana around his neck and a sense of purpose in every step. At his side was Officer Ethan Cole, dressed not in uniform, but in a button-up shirt and tie. Even out of uniform, he still moved with the calm confidence of someone who had seen the worst of the world and now, finally, was witnessing something unquestionably right. When Emily saw them, her whole face lit up. She stepped forward, crouched, and wrapped her arms around Shadow without hesitation. "You came," she whispered. Shadow answered with a slow wag of his tail and a gentle nuzzle against her shoulder. Judge Helen Blake stood behind the bench, this time with a softness in her eyes rarely seen from the bench. Today, she wasn't holding a gavel. She was holding a photo album, a gift she had quietly put together for the family after that unforgettable day 3 weeks earlier. "Shall we begin?" she asked gently. Emily nodded. The judge walked around the bench and sat at the table beside Emily, placing the adoption papers in front of her. "Emily," she said, her voice warm and steady, "today you're going to sign your name. A new name, but what's written here doesn't erase who you've been. It simply tells the world who you'll belong to from this day forward." Emily looked down at the paper. The line where her new name would go, Emily Whitmore. Her hand trembled slightly as she picked up the pen. She glanced sideways at Shadow, who sat beside her now, eyes steady and unwavering. It was as if he was telling her, "Go ahead, this is your moment," and she wrote it. Slowly, carefully, letter by letter. As soon as the final stroke of her name was completed, the room broke into applause. Not the kind of loud, thunderous cheering you'd hear at a graduation. No, this was gentler, full of tears, hugs and smiles so wide they almost hurt. Mr. Whitmore wrapped Emily in a firm, steady embrace. Mrs. Whitmore kissed the top of her head. The caseworker wiped her eyes, then hugged all three of them together. And Shadow. He sat there proudly, tail wagging, head held high. Because somehow, he knew. He had carried this child through uncertainty, through fear, through the moment she stopped being part of a system and became part of a home. After the signing, Judge Blake handed Emily the photo album. "This," she said, "is for your new beginning. But the first picture, that's from the moment you showed us all who you really are." Emily opened it. Inside, the very first image was a candid photo, slightly blurry, but unmistakable, of Emily kneeling beside Sophie, one hand on Shadow's back, the other gently holding Sophie's. It was the moment that had changed everything. As the formalities ended, Emily knelt one more time beside Shadow. She leaned in and whispered into his ear, "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you." Then, in front of the judge, her new parents, and every smiling face in the room, Emily did something few people ever do at an adoption ceremony. She presented a medal. It was small, handmade, strung on a ribbon of red felt. On it was written in neat, childlike handwriting, "Hero of my story." She hung it around Shadow's neck, and everyone in the room, even the officers, wiped their eyes. Outside the courthouse, balloons waited. A cake with Emily's new name had been delivered. A sign read, "Welcome home, Emily." And as they stepped out into the sunlight, Emily turned around one last time and looked at the courthouse behind her. It had once been a place of judgment, of fear, of waiting. Now, it was the place where she found family, where a dog broke protocol to change her fate, where love had walked in unannounced and made everything new. Later that night, back at her new home, Emily sat on her own bed, in her own room for the first time in her life. Shadow lay curled on the rug beside her. She reached down and rested her hand on his back.
"I think you knew I belonged somewhere," she whispered, "and I think you found it for me." Shadow didn't move, but his tail thumped once.
And that was all the answer she needed. The paperwork was done. The gavel had fallen. The name was changed. Emily Carter had become Emily Whitmore. And yet, as she sat on the back porch of her new home that evening, the weight of it all didn't feel heavy, it felt light. Like something had finally settled. Something that had been drifting for years had landed, softly, and finally, where it belonged. Shadow lay beside her, his massive head resting across her bare feet. The sunset painted the sky in ribbons of gold and lavender. The crickets had just started their evening chorus, and in that quiet space, between day and night, Emily found herself remembering everything that had brought her here, not the court dates or the signatures, but the moments in between. She remembered the way Shadow had pulled Officer Cole into courtroom 2B like a dog possessed. She remembered the silence that followed the bang of the courtroom doors swinging open, the look on people's faces, the sheer disbelief. She remembered finding Sophie Monroe beneath the judge's bench, frightened, hidden, forgotten. She remembered how Shadow didn't leave her side. How he had stayed not just physically, but emotionally, anchoring the room to something real when everyone else was too stunned to move. She remembered how she, a child with no title or role, had simply walked forward and done what no adult had done, held Sophie's hand, spoken to her in her mother's language, offered comfort, not questions. And that was when everything changed. At school, they call her brave now. At home, they call her strong. But Emily doesn't think of herself as either of those things. She just remembers what it felt like to see someone lost and recognize the feeling so deeply in her own bones that she couldn't stay seated. Judge Helen Blake had said something that stuck with her. "It's not always the law that changes people's lives," she had said that day after the adoption was finalized. "Sometimes it's kindness. Sometimes it's the courage to act when you don't have to." Emily hadn't known what to say then, but sitting on the porch now, with Shadow beside her, she finally understood. The miracle hadn't been the adoption decree. That had been the end of a story that started long before. The real miracle had been the choice to care, made over and over again. When a canine dog broke protocol because something deeper than training told him a child was in danger. When a little girl stepped forward, not because anyone told her to, but because her heart had never stopped working, even when the world around her had. When a family who wasn't sure they were ready saw not just a child, but a leader, a healer, a daughter. People often think of miracles as lightning bolts, sudden, spectacular, divine. But Emily had learned they come in other forms too. A warm nose nudging a child out of fear, a hand reaching across silence, a name signed on a page, but lived into with love. The next day, Shadow was honored again, this time at his precinct. The department brought out his old service collar and placed a commemorative badge on his vest that read, "Shadow, Service Above Self." A reporter asked Officer Ethan Cole if Shadow had been trained for this kind of search and rescue response. Ethan smiled. "No," he said. "He wasn't trained to find lost kids in courtrooms. He was trained to find danger, to follow orders." But that day, he followed his heart instead of my command. And I've never been prouder to be wrong. Later, the reporter turned to Emily, microphone in hand. "How did it feel knowing a dog saved a child, and maybe helped save you too?" Emily looked at Shadow, then back at the camera. "It didn't feel like saving," she said simply. "It felt like someone finally saw her. And I knew what that felt like, so I sat with her until she wasn't scared anymore." She paused, thoughtful. "Maybe that's what heroes do.
Not fix everything. Just stay long enough for someone to stop feeling invisible. Back on the porch that night, as the last light slipped behind the trees, Emily whispered, "I think you knew I needed them before they knew they needed me." Shadow thumped his tail once, then nudged her elbow with his nose. She laughed and leaned against him. "I don't think we saved each other," she said. "I think we reminded them all what love really looks like." Inside, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore were preparing a small celebration. Nothing big. Just cake, music, and a new photo to place on the mantel. This one would show Emily, seated proudly between her parents, with Shadow at her feet. No need for captions, because everyone who looked at it would know the truth. This wasn't the story of a courtroom victory. It was the story of loyalty, of second chances, and of a girl and a dog who didn't wait for permission to care. And in a world full of rules, files, and waiting lists, that is the kind of miracle that no law book could ever explain. Life lesson. Some of the greatest acts of love require no permission. In a world full of rules, procedures, and waiting lists, this story reminds us that the most powerful moments of connection often come from listening to the heart, not the handbook. A loyal dog broke protocol because something deeper than training told him a child was in danger. A little girl, broken by the system, stepped forward, not because anyone asked, but because she remembered what it felt like to be lost. We often wait for the right time to act kindly, to comfort, to speak up. But sometimes the miracle isn't in the solution, it's in the presence, in staying, in noticing, in simply sitting beside someone who's afraid. For older generations who have seen the world move faster and colder, this story is a quiet call to return to something timeless, human compassion. You don't need authority to be kind. You don't need credentials to care. Whether you're holding a leash, a hand, or someone's story, your presence could be someone else's turning point. Let love interrupt. Let it break in without warning. Because sometimes the most lasting rescue doesn't happen in the courtroom, it happens in the heart.